Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 2 about constitutional history, and this is Lesson 6 about America gaining its independence. In this lesson, you'll learn about the First Continental Congress, about the Powder Alarm, about the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the Declaration of Independence. Now let me remind you of something that we learned in the last lesson about how disagreements between the colonists and the officials back in London had led to escalating hostilities between the colonies and the empire. The colonists believed that they couldn't be taxed, even to provide for the soldiers that were defending them, if they were not represented in the Parliament. But the officials back in the home country of England refused to provide them with representation in Parliament. And so this impasse led to worsening problems between the two groups. And eventually the Boston Tea Party, and then in follow-up to that, the Parliament passed what were known as the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, a series of laws that essentially punished Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. Now, this act of the Parliament to punish one of the colonies caused fear throughout the other colonies that they might come under similar forceful actions if they got out of line with what the mother country wanted. And so this great concern that was growing in the colonies led them to meet together in 1774 in what became known as the Continental Congress. Now, in the previous lesson, I talked about the Stamp Act Congress, where 9 of the 13 colonies got together, and that was the beginning of them feeling unified against a common enemy, this government across the ocean that was trying to impose taxes on them without representation. Now you had 12 of the colonies that were in attendance. The one colony that didn't attend was the state of Georgia. Now, the state of Georgia was the farthest away from the meeting, but also they were concerned about causing offense with the English government because they were looking for help to deal with some of their own internal problems, specifically some conflicts with Native Americans on their frontier. So no representatives from Georgia came to this meeting, but eventually they get involved. So this Continental Congress meets, and they talk about their problems with England. And they end up coming to some resolutions of what to do about it. Now on this slide you see that I have in brackets First Continental Congress. And the reason is because there's another meeting later on that becomes known as the Second Continental Congress, thus causing us to call this one the First Continental Congress. So one of the big accomplishments of the First Continental Congress was to actually call for this second meeting that would take place the next year. Georgia would come to it. All 13 of the colonies would be represented. And what's significant about that is that you have this ongoing relationship then between the colonies, working together, unified against what they see as oppressive actions of their mother country. But that isn't the only thing that the First Continental Congress accomplished. Perhaps most importantly, it called for a boycott of goods coming in from Great Britain. And it called on the colonies to form what became known as committees of safety to monitor that the boycott would actually be enforced. Now, this is important because you have these colonial governments that respond to this call for boycott, establishing, well, actually, I shouldn't say colonial governments, colonial peoples trying to enforce this boycott, establishing their own sort of shadow governments, separate from the ones authorized by the government in England, to monitor and persuade people to actually follow the boycott. These shadow governments, these committees of safety, ended up becoming the framework around which the governments that fought the American Revolution would be built, and the governments that eventually became the state governments would be built. So the Continental Congress encouraged these independent actions of the people within the colonies in opposition to the government of the mother country back in England. Now, as they were encouraging this opposition, the people in the colonies were growing increasingly nervous about the British troops stationed among them and the conflicts that were growing. They were concerned that they might have to defend their freedom with use of arms. So colonial militias that had been organized for centuries, really, among the people for self-defense on the frontier against Native Americans, against invasion from the French or whatever, were now being exercised to potentially be used against the armies of their own home country. Now, as they were being mobilized, please understand what the militias were. A militia was a amateur military force that was organized community by community of the local people there. They supplied their own arms, their own guns, but they did drill together and work together to create a force that was capable of repelling enemies. And so they began to think about possibly the British Army as being their enemies. And they began to train and gain supplies that would be necessary if they had to fight. Now, the supplies were generally stored in armories. And here's a picture of one. Notice that it's out in the middle of some trees, away from all other buildings. And the reason for that was in a local community, while the individual people all owned their own guns, owned their own shot, owned their own gunpowder, and basically everybody did, it was dangerous to keep these things within their homes. The black powder that was used to fire the guns could easily explode. And if you were in a town surrounded by other houses and the powder in your house exploded, it could set your house on fire, it could cause damage to spread to other buildings, and so it was a really dangerous thing. And so to avoid that, the people in a town would all store their arms together outside the area where the other buildings were in a armory of some sort. Well, what happened was in 1774, the British troops near Boston were concerned about these militias drilling, these militias building up armaments, and so they started engaging in raids of these armories. And one in particular became known as the powder alarm. They went into a building where the gunpowder was stored, and the British troops confiscated it, and this caused a great alarm among the civilian population there, worried that they were going to have their guns taken away from them, leaving them defenseless against this government that in their view was becoming oppressive. So they decided they were never going to let this happen again. In response to the powder alarm then, they set up a system to warn people if the soldiers from the British government were going to go out and try to confiscate people's guns or gunpowder, etc. Part of this system for warning people was a man named Paul Revere. Now, famously, Paul Revere goes riding into the night yelling, "The British are coming, the British are coming," to warn people that the troops are out on the march to go confiscate people's guns. And he did that when the plan was for these British troops to march to a place called Concord via a town called Lexington outside of Boston. These are small towns that were outside of Boston. To then confiscate militia armaments that were being stored in Concord. Well, along the way, because Paul Revere and others had rode out and warned the countryside that the British troops were coming, the local militias went and got their guns and prepared for a potential battle. Along the way, they faced off with each other. To this day, we don't know who started shooting first, but somebody did. They started shooting each other, and at that point, you had these colonial citizens, Americans, who were being killed by regular British soldiers, and you had regular British soldiers being killed by the colonial citizens. So once they're shooting and killing each other, then all hopes at reconciliation are gone. War is coming. Now, this first couple of battles and the shots that were fired there became known, in the words of a poet, as the shot heard round the world. Because whoever fired those first shots in these conflicts at Lexington and Concord initiated the American Revolution, which led to the founding of the United States of America, which would eventually become the most powerful nation on earth. So this truly was a shot heard around the world, whoever it was that may have fired it first. Well, once the people are shooting each other, when the colonies get together to meet again in the Second Continental Congress, it becomes obvious that reconciliation with the government back home in England is impossible. And all 13 colonies are there now, including Georgia. And so the big thing that the Second Continental Congress does is they write the Declaration of Independence. Now, when I say they write, yes, it was collectively signed by them, but the primary author of it was Thomas Jefferson, who would later become President of the United States. So the Declaration of Independence was written by the Continental Congress the Second Continental Congress in 1776. It was signed by the members of that Congress. And what it did was, in its own words, you can see here a quote from it, it established that these united colonies are free and independent states. Now, the reason they thought they could make this declaration, because at the beginning of this quote you can see that they say it's the right of a people to alter and abolish their government when it becomes destructive toward them, which they thought the government of England was becoming. So they therefore thought they could sever their ties with it and establish themselves as it says here, free and independent states, which can do anything independent states have a right to do. Now, what's particularly important about this quote is noticing one letter in particular, and that's at the end of the word states. There's an S there. It's plural. Because what happened with the Declaration of Independence was these 13 separate little colonies had become 13 separate little countries now. That's what independent states means. We learned this in one of the very first lessons of this course, that properly used the word state should be thought of as a country rather than a part of a country. And that's how it was being used here in the Declaration of Independence. That document created 13 brand new separate little countries. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what did the First Continental Congress do? Did it end the stamp tax? Did it call for the colonies to boycott British goods? Or did it create the Declaration of Independence? Or was it the Constitutional Convention? The correct answer is that it led the boycott of British goods. Next question for review. What was the powder alarm? Was it a raid of an armory? Was it Paul Revere's ride? Was it a fatal explosion? Or was it a revolutionary battle? The powder alarm was an armory raid, where British troops went out and confiscated the arms of the colonists, and that made the colonists very fearful about having their guns taken away, which caused them to organize further toward revolution. Next question. What happened at Lexington and Concord? Was it a peace conference? Was it one of the first battles of the Revolution? Was it the Continental Congress that met there? Or were there large protests held there? At Lexington and Concord, we had the first battles of the American Revolution. Who created the Declaration of Independence? Was it the Stamp Act Congress? Was it the First Continental Congress? Was it the Second Continental Congress? Or was it a Confederation Congress? The correct answer is that it was the Second Continental Congress that created the Declaration of Independence. And then finally, our last review question for this lesson. What was the result of the Declaration of Independence? Did it not actually change anything? Or did it create a brand new country? Or did it create 13 new countries? Or did it cause the British surrender? The correct answer is that it created 13 brand new little countries. All right, that does it for this lesson. Our next lesson will be lesson 7 about the Articles of Confederation.